Okay, hopefully this is working. Once more, I'm hanging out in my kitchen, and in this short video clip, what we're going to be talking about is Chris Outzen's paper on Chris Kluwe's infamous letter. Couple things. I mean, I've seen and I've read Chris's paper. I've read or I've seen Alex's feedback that he gave, and I think that Alex makes a number of really good points. Or excuse me, Adam makes a number of really good points. In particular, one of the things I liked about what Adam did is he walked through and was like, here's the criteria that Jim laid out for the class in terms of what constitutes, a good, artifact for critical theory, and he just kind of went through and showed how Chris's selected artifact, the text that Chris wants to look at, meets all of those criteria. And I think that's good. Now, I do have some issues that I want to raise relative to that concern. First, preface this by saying I love the text. I think that this is the kind of thing that I see being really a good candidate for a conference coming up in 2013. Whether or not you're thinking about Alta or NCA, I think this is definitely the kind of artifact that has a lot of credibility in that area, a lot of currency is probably a better word. That people are going to want to have panels that look at or deal with this particular subject. Kluwe's speech that he gave back in the early fall would have meant that it was given kind of too late to appear at NCA in November, that the submissions were already in. So I think that this is the time. If you're ever thinking about doing a Chris Kluwe paper, this is the time to do a Chris Kluwe paper. So that's great. Now, in terms of the course, a couple things that I want to bring up. The first thing is although the text is strong in terms of its impact, influence, those areas, that it's the right kind of paper, it does got the problem of being short. And it's not just short, it's also not especially theoretically or dense or complicated. And that doesn't mean that you can't do it. It means that there's going to be some methodologies that just straight up are not going to work for this. And another thing that I want you to consider is kind of the author's purpose. I think that you're going to want to make the argument at some point as to why we, as your readers, should treat this as a rhetorical text rather than as, comedic or just a rant. Like, what is it about the text that makes it rhetorical? That's a question that I think you're going to want to definitely deal with. In that respect, I think you're going to want to deal with it in terms of some theory, and that's the one thing that I want to see from everyone more of in at least this first round of papers, is I want to see more in terms of theory. I got a cat running around on my counter here. Hang on just a second. Silly kitten. I'd reshoot this whole thing if I had time, but I don't. So anyway, okay, theoretically, the one thing that I want you to really look at, I want you to consider very much looking at Poukoulos's essay on sophistic rhetoric. In particular, because one of the things that Poukoulos talks about in that essay is he's talking about the idea of that what is rhetorical means fitting a particular time, place, occasion, setting, etc. Challenging this notion that there's any such thing as, the good speech, the right speech, the best speech, which is what Aristotle and the Platonics were about. So that notion of fitting and appropriate, the notion of kairos, and how that would apply to it. I mean, the question you'd be asking is not whether or not Kluwe gives a good letter or makes a good argument, but was the argument the right argument for this time and place? And I think that looking at those notions of fitting and appropriateness to occasions and situations, and the idea of kairos in particular, the qualitative sense of fittingness in time, I think it would be really helpful to your essay. The other thing that I think that is worth considering is to look at Weaver's essay on the ethics of rhetoric. One of the things that you're going to have to ask yourself, I mean, you simply cannot escape the notion of the profanity-ladenness of Kluwe's response. I like the short little clip that Adam included in his, where they were using the term cock monster back and forth, and is it okay to call a state legislator a cock monster? Well, I didn't call him a cock monster. In fact, I said he wasn't going to become a cock monster. So that was, I think, pretty interesting. The other thing that I think was kind of unique on that and of interest was the idea of just lost it. The profanity latenness of the text is just that is perhaps its most defining feature. Yeah, it's a defense of free speech rights, and yes, it's going to raise these questions about athletes, but I think in particular the question of the profanity is going to be one that is an inescapable element of your research. There's just no way around it. Now, what Weaver's going to ask in the Ethics of Rhetoric, and he's going to say in that text, he's going to argue that when we're studying rhetoric, we can't not look at ethics. That a text can do one of three things. It can hypothetically fail to move us at all, and he questions whether or not that's any more than a theoretical possibility. Or it can move us towards what is good, or it can move us toward what is not good. He uses the term evil. And the essence of what I think Weaver's arguing, and I think an important part of his argument that I want to make sure that comes through, is this idea that how we argue is just as important as what we argue for. Is it possible for us to argue for the right things, but do it in a way that still makes us unethical? Now, for example, we could argue that lying is by its very nature always unethical, and that it's always wrong to lie, even if you're lying for a good cause. Now, certainly there are some people who will say that no, it's okay to lie if your cause is just, but setting aside that kind of argument for right now, there is this idea of is it okay to lie, or that it's wrong, some modes of argument are wrong, even if our purposes, our motives, our goals are right. Now, if that's the case, we have to ask ourselves about this notion of profanity. And in many ways, I mean, as a kind of Aristotelian, Weaver is taking very much the counterpoint to Poulikos in this notion of saying, listen, no, there are some things that are always going to be degrading to our audience, even if our cause is right, and our cause is just, and our purposes are good. The way that we argue impacts people. It shapes them as members of an audience. It shapes their consciousness. It shapes their behavior. And perhaps we need to really consider whether or not what he did was okay, even if it had all of these maybe good consequences, that perhaps on a rhetorical level we could still argue that it's unethical. So I'd really like you to take a look at Poulikos, and I'd like you to take a look at Weaver and see how they impact it. Now, challenges coming up in the future I think are really going to be great. I think that Unit 2, because it tends to deal with more formal structures, you might have a little bit of challenges with Unit 2. I think you're going to glide through Units 3 and 4. I really, really do. I think that Unit 3, because it's going to be able to look at style, you're going to really be able to dig into this notion of profanity in particular, and what makes profanity profane, and what makes, the whole notion of profanity I think is going to be a cool one for you to deal with. The fourth unit, on more critical perspectives and ideological criticism, I think too. I wrote this in your paper, but just kind of for everyone, this is going to be a really interesting kind of topic in terms of rhetoric in sports, and that sports has, on one hand, generally had a very conservative sort of influence, in particular in terms of gender, right, but also in terms of things like race, sexuality, the idea that, sport should be apolitical, that sport should be a place where these political questions don't appear, and yet consistently over time they in fact do appear in sport, which I think is really, really fascinating, particularly when I challenge it. And this might come up with Adam's paper on CM Punk too, but I would strongly encourage you to look at some of the work by a writer named Dave Zirin. Dave Zirin writes on critical theory and sports, in particular looking at things like, for example, the raising of the fists by the two African-American athletes at the Mexico City Olympics, right? The black gloved hands over their head as they accepted their awards is kind of this, statement that, here we're recognized as the best in the world, but at home we're still discriminated against. That got them in huge amounts of trouble with the Olympic Commission because it was supposed to be a political event, and yet clearly to ignore racial issues is itself a political position, right? In the same way, I think Cluey, saying, that sports is not apolitical, not just because athletes don't have the ability, or have the profile to the point where what they say and do matters to huge numbers of people, but the idea that to depoliticize sport is in fact a political move in and of itself. And all of these I think are really, really interesting. So anyway, I think you've got some great things to look at, some great ideas to explore, some great ideas to play with, and I look forward to seeing what you do with this project. Thanks a lot.